I still remember the exact moment my wife Emma dropped the bombshell. She had applied for a senior management job in another state without even telling me, and now she had the offer. I just stood there, stunned, as she told me she wanted to move the entire family, me, her, and our 8-year-old twins, to start this new chapter of her career. It wasn't just the news itself that threw me off. It was the fact that she'd made this life-changing decision without so much as a conversation with me. That was the beginning of everything falling apart. We'd been married for 10 years by then, together for 12. It wasn't perfect, but whose marriage is? We had built a life here close to my parents, and for good reason. My dad had been battling leukemia for a couple of years. It was bad, really bad. My mom was doing her best to hold it together, but she needed support, and as their only child, I needed to be here. I couldn't just pack up and leave them behind. Emma knew that. She'd been there through my dad's diagnosis, had seen the toll it was taking on all of us. That's why her decision felt like a punch in the face. When she first told me about the job offer, she tried to frame it as an opportunity for all of us, a fresh start. It's a great position with a salary that could set us up for years, she said. But all I could think was, how could you plan something so big without me? I didn't say much that night. I just congratulated her, though it felt forced. And we both went to bed without another word. The next morning, we had one of the worst fights of our marriage. She called me selfish for refusing to consider moving. I told her it was selfish to expect me to abandon my parents when they needed me the most. I'll admit I lost my temper. My dad's health had been my top priority since the day he got sick, and I thought Emma understood that. But in that moment, it was like we were living in two completely different realities. She kept saying she felt stuck here and that she needed this change, while I was stuck thinking about how I couldn't possibly leave. We didn't resolve anything that day or the next. The arguments just kept coming, and every time we dug our heels in deeper. At one point, I tried to explain how much this move would devastate my mom. If I left, she'd be handling all of my dad's medical needs on her own, and even though I have extended family around, none of them could take on the role I had as their only child. But Emma just brushed it off. She said I was being overly sensitive, like my dad's illness wasn't a good enough reason to put our plans on hold. Before all this, we'd actually been talking about moving. She'd wanted a change of scenery for a while, and at the time I was open to it. But that was before the diagnosis. Once that came into the picture, moving was off the table for me. I thought she understood that. I thought we were on the same page. Clearly we weren't. What hurt even more was how she started acting like I was holding her back on purpose. "You're sabotaging my career," she told me during one of our fights. "Do you expect me to sit around here forever just waiting for your dad to..." She didn't finish the sentence, but I knew exactly what she was going to say. It hit me like a slap across the face. My dad wasn't just some inconvenience. He was my father, and I was doing what any decent son would do. The tension in our house got unbearable after that. We barely spoke unless it was about the kids, and even those conversations were short and cold. I tried to talk about other solutions. Maybe she could commute or take the job temporarily while we figured things out. But she wasn't interested. She wanted all of us to move or nothing at all, and I just couldn't do it. I'll never forget the day she finally packed a bag and left to stay with her parents for a while. She didn't even tell me she was going. She just came home after work, grabbed some clothes, and said, "I need some space." I didn't try to stop her. At that point, I wasn't sure if I even knew who she was anymore. That's how it started. One decision, one job application, and suddenly, everything we'd built over 12 years felt like it was crumbling right in front of me. When Emma came back from her parents' house after a few days, I thought maybe she'd cool down and we could talk things through. But instead of things getting better, it felt like we were tiptoeing around each other, avoiding the big conversation that needed to happen. Then one evening, she sat me down and told me her decision. She was taking the job. She said she had thought long and hard, and this was something she had to do for herself. But here was the kicker. She wasn't asking me to come with her anymore. Instead, she suggested we try living apart. She would move to the new city, start her job, and travel back to see the kids and me on weekends. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me was relieved that she wasn't pushing me to uproot my life, but another part of me felt like this was the beginning of the end. I mean, how does a marriage survive when one person decides to leave like that? She was trying to frame it as a compromise, saying it was the best way for both of us to get what we wanted. But all I could hear was that she had already chosen her career over our family. We fought about it, of course. She said, "I'm not abandoning you. I'm just trying to do something for myself for once." I told her that marriage wasn't about me and you. It was about us. But she wasn't hearing it. She was determined to go, and no amount of arguing was going to change her mind. Eventually, I gave in. I told myself it was temporary, that we'd figure it out. Maybe the time apart would give us the space we needed to cool off and come back stronger. At least that's what I tried to convince myself. But deep down, I think I knew this was bigger than a job. Something fundamental between us had shifted, and I wasn't sure we could fix it. So she left. She packed up her things and moved to her new apartment in the city where her job was. The first couple of weekends, she came back as promised. The kids were so excited to see her, and I tried to act like everything was fine. But it wasn't. Those weekends felt rushed and awkward, like we were all pretending nothing had changed when everything had. During the week, I tried to keep things as normal as possible for the kids. School, homework, dinners at the table. But they noticed. They started asking when their mom was coming home for good, and I didn't have a good answer for them. She's busy with work, I'd say, but even they could tell something was off. And then there were the phone calls, or the lack of them. Emma and I had agreed to check in during the week, but it didn't take long for that to fall apart. At first, she'd call every other night, then it was just once or twice a week. Eventually, I was the one doing all the calling, and half the time she wouldn't even pick up. When she did, she was short with me, almost like she was annoyed I'd called at all. The kids didn't get much better treatment. She'd talk to them for a few minutes, ask about their day, and then rush off the phone saying she was tired or busy. I could see how much it hurt them, but what could I do? I was trying to hold everything together for them while Emma was out there living her new life. The turning point came about 4 months after she'd moved. She came home one weekend, but something was different. She seemed distant, even more than usual. And then, out of nowhere, she handed me a stack of papers, divorce papers. She sat me down and said, "I can't do this anymore." Just like that. No warning, no discussion. I was furious, but more than that, I was heartbroken. How did we get here? How did 12 years together end with a pile of papers on the kitchen table? I didn't even have the energy to fight her on it at that point. I was so drained from months of arguments and the constant stress of our situation that I just nodded and said, "Fine." She told me she thought this was the best thing for everyone, but I couldn't help but feel like this was all for her, that the rest of us were just collateral damage in her quest to be happy. Looking back, I don't know if there was anything I could have done differently. She'd made up her mind long before that conversation, and I was just the last one to find out. After Emma moved and our divorce became inevitable, I started noticing changes in her that I hadn't seen before. A big part of it, I think, was the people she started surrounding herself with. One name kept coming up, Berlin. She was an old friend from high school, someone Emma used to be close to years ago. I knew Berlin too, but I'd never liked her. She always gave off this vibe like she was out for herself and didn't care who got hurt in the process, the kind of person who chased wealthy men not for love, but for what they could provide. It was no secret either. Berlin used to brag about it like it was some kind of accomplishment. Emma and Berlin had drifted apart for years, but after Emma moved for her job, Berlin somehow reappeared. She lived in the same state, and they started hanging out again. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured Emma was lonely in a new place and needed someone familiar. But as their friendship grew, things started to change. Emma would come home on the weekends and talk about Berlin and her new circle of friends like they were these amazing, inspiring women. I'll never forget the way she described them. Single moms who were, in her words, strong, independent, and living life on their own terms. But the more I learned about them, the less impressed I was. From what Emma told me, These women weren't exactly role models. Most of them had gotten involved with rich, married men, had kids, and were now living comfortably off child support and hush money. They painted this picture of freedom and empowerment, but all I saw was manipulation and greed. I didn't say much at first. Emma was already defensive about a lot of things, and I didn't want to start another fight. But eventually, I told her how I felt. I said I didn't think Berlin and her friends were the kind of people she should be taking advice from, especially about relationships and family. Emma brushed it off, said I was being judgmental, and told me I didn't know these women like she did. That was the end of that conversation, at least for a while. What I didn't realize at the time was how much influence these people were starting to have on her. Berlin, in particular, seemed to have her ear. And it wasn't long before I started to feel like I was being slowly pushed out of Emma's life. Every decision she made seemed to line up more and more with the kind of lifestyle Berlin and her friends promoted. When Emma filed for divorce, I couldn't help but think Berlin had something to do with it. I didn't have proof, of course, but the timing felt too convenient. Emma admitted later, much later, that Berlin and her friends had encouraged her to go through with a divorce. They told her it was empowering, that she deserved to be happy, and that if I couldn't support her dreams, then she was better off without me. To them, a family and a decade-long marriage were just obstacles, things to shed like old skin so you could move on to the next chapter of your life. I guess Emma bought into that, at least for a while. It was frustrating because I had warned her. I told her that Berlin wasn't a good influence, that her advice was selfish and short-sighted, but Emma didn't want to hear it. She was caught up in this idea of freedom and independence that Berlin and her friends were selling. And the worst part was that Emma's choices didn't just affect her. They affected me, our kids, and the life we'd built together. After the divorce was finalized, Emma stayed in touch with Berlin and her group. She even started talking about them like they were her support system. But as time went on, cracks started to show. Emma stopped bragging about how empowered she felt and started sounding, well, lonely. She called me one night and admitted that she'd started to feel disconnected from these women, like they weren't as supportive or uplifting as she'd originally thought. I wasn't surprised. They never cared about her. They cared about pulling her into their way of thinking. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done. Our marriage was over, our family was split, and Emma was left trying to piece together a new life. And for what? Some misguided idea of happiness that someone else convinced her she deserved. It's hard not to feel bitter about that. I fought so hard to keep us together, but in the end, her so-called friends did more damage than I ever could have imagined. When the divorce papers were finally signed, it felt like someone had flipped a switch in my life. Everything that had been so chaotic for months suddenly became quiet, too quiet. There wasn't any dramatic court battle or custody fight. Emma didn't even want to argue about who got what. She left the house to me and the kids, saying she'd figure things out later. At the time, I thought maybe that was her way of easing her guilt, or maybe she just didn't want to deal with the hassle. Either way, it was done. For the kids' sake, we tried to keep things civil. Emma agreed to come back on weekends to spend time with them. She didn't stay at the house, though. She'd either take them to her parents' place or out for some kind of activity. I could tell the kids were confused. They were young, but not so young that they didn't notice the change. One night my son asked me, "Why does mom not live here anymore?" How do you answer that? I told him something about grown-ups having disagreements and needing space. I didn't know what else to say without making things worse. The weekends became this weird routine. Emma would pick up the kids on Friday night or Saturday morning, depending on her schedule. Then she'd bring them back Sunday evening. At first, she tried to include me in family activities, things like going to the park or out for dinner, but it didn't feel right. I wasn't ready to play pretend like we were still some happy little family. Eventually, she stopped asking, and I think she was relieved. During the week, it was just me and the kids. I'd get them up for school, help with homework, and do my best to keep the house running. It was a lot to juggle, especially since I was also trying to keep up with work, but at least I had a routine. Emma, on the other hand, seemed to be struggling. When she'd call during the week, which wasn't often, she sounded tired, distracted. Sometimes she wouldn't call at all. The kids started to notice that too. I remember one weekend, Emma showed up late to pick them up. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. She tried to play it off, saying work was just stressful, but I could tell there was more to it. She'd moved out to chase this big dream, and now she was realizing it wasn't what she thought it would be. Her job, which had sounded so amazing on paper, wasn't panning out. She'd mentioned in passing that the company wasn't doing as well as they'd claimed, and everyone was facing salary cuts. She'd built her decision to leave on a foundation that was already crumbling, and now she was stuck trying to hold it together. Then there were the friends. Remember Berlin and her crew? They'd been so eager to push Emma into this new chapter of her life, but now that she needed real support, they were nowhere to be found. Emma didn't say much about it, but I could tell she'd stopped mentioning them in conversations, and the few times she did, it wasn't with the same enthusiasm as before. I think she was finally seeing them for who they really were. But by that point, what could I do? I'd already spent so much time trying to warn her, trying to fight for our marriage, and all it had gotten me was a divorce. My focus was on the kids now. I wanted to make sure they felt loved and supported, even if their world had been turned upside down. The first big test came when Emma and I had to sit down and talk about the future. Custody, finances, all the things we'd been avoiding. She suggested a verbal agreement where the kids would stay primarily with me and she'd visit regularly. I agreed, but I made it clear that this wasn't just about convenience. The kids needed stability, and they needed a parent who was fully present. Emma didn't argue. I think she knew she wasn't in a place to take on that responsibility right now. Even so, there was this moment during that conversation where she looked at me, and I could see how much regret she was carrying. She didn't say it outright, but it was there in her face, in the way her voice shook when she talked about missing the kids. For a split second, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered everything. The choices she'd made, the people she'd listened to, and the fact that she'd walked out on us. Whatever she was feeling, it was a mess of her own making. By the time she left that day, I felt like I'd finally closed the book on us. I wasn't angry anymore, just done. My energy had to go toward the people who mattered most now, our kids, and that's exactly what I did. Around a month after the divorce was finalized, Emma called me. It was late, way past the time she'd usually reach out. I thought it might be something about the kids, so I picked up right away. But the voice on the other end wasn't the composed, almost distant Emma I'd been dealing with for months. She was crying, barely able to get her words out at first. I was alarmed. I asked if something had happened to her or the kids, but she kept saying, "I'm so sorry. I made a mistake." That threw me off. I didn't know what she was talking about at first, but as she kept talking, it all started coming out. She told me how lonely she'd been since the divorce. She said the life she thought she wanted wasn't what she expected, that it felt empty. She tried dating, even went on a few blind dates, but nothing stuck. Every time she'd find herself comparing these men to me, to our life together, and it hit her that she'd thrown it all away for something that didn't even exist. I didn't know how to respond. I just sat there listening. Part of me wanted to comfort her. Another part of me wanted to hang up, because as much as she was pouring her heart out, all I could think about was how much pain her decisions had caused, not just for me, but for the kids. It was hard to feel sympathy for someone who had burned down the life we built together and was now crying about the ashes. Then she said something that really stuck with me. She admitted that Berlin and her so-called friends had pushed her to file for divorce. They'd convinced her that she deserved better, that her family was holding her back, and that she'd find happiness once she was free. But once the papers were signed and she was out there on her own, they weren't the support system they claimed to be. She'd realized that these women didn't care about her. They cared about validating their own choices. They'd used her situation to make themselves feel better. And when she was struggling, they weren't there for her. Hearing that made me angrier than I already was. I told her, "I warned you about them. I told you they weren't good people, but you didn't want to listen." She started apologizing again, saying she should have trusted me, that she should have fought harder for us. But at that point, what could I do with her apologies? It was too late. The damage was done. What really pushed me over the edge, though, was when she started talking about her job. She admitted that things weren't going well at work either. The company that had seemed so promising was cutting salaries and overworking employees. She was miserable there and she wanted to quit. And as she kept talking, I realized something. This wasn't just about regret or guilt. She wanted to come back, not just to the kids, but to me. She said she missed us, that she missed the stability of our family, the life we had together. She wanted to come home and start over. But all I could feel was frustration. I told her, "You made your choice, Emma. You listened to people who didn't care about you, and now you're living with the consequences." She started crying harder, begging me to reconsider, saying she'd do whatever it took to fix things, but I couldn't trust her anymore. How could I? She'd left when I needed her the most. She'd put herself first, and now that things weren't going the way she wanted, she was looking for a way out. I told her I wasn't interested in starting over. I said my focus was on the kids now, and that they didn't need to be caught up in this back and forth. They needed stability, and that's what I was going to give them. She tried to argue, saying she could be better, that she could make it work this time, but I shut it down. I told her, "We don't need you, Emma. The kids and I are doing fine without you." Maybe that was harsh, but it was the truth. When I hung up, I felt this mix of anger and relief. I was angry that she thought she could just come back and fix everything like it was that simple. But I was relieved because for the first time, I felt like I had control over my life again. She wasn't going to drag me back into the chaos she'd created. The next morning, I woke up to messages from her parents telling me I'd been too hard on her. They said she was devastated and that I should have been more understanding. But what they didn't get was that I had spent years being understanding, and where had that gotten me? No. This time, I was choosing myself and the kids. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them. After that call with Emma, something shifted in me. I felt like I had finally closed the door on that chapter of my life. I wasn't angry anymore, at least not in the same way. It was more of an acceptance that things were never going to go back to how they were, and honestly, I didn't want them to. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had some clarity about what I needed to do. Focus on my kids and rebuild my life one step at a time. Emma stuck to her word about being more present for the kids. A few weeks after our conversation, she left her job and moved back to our town. She got an apartment just a few blocks away, which made it easier for the kids to split their time between us. I'll admit I was skeptical at first. I wondered if she'd really follow through or if this was just another attempt to ease her guilt. But to her credit, she showed up. She was there for school events, she made time for their activities, and she started building a relationship with them again. I could see the kids were happier having her around more. They didn't fully understand everything that had happened between us, and I wasn't about to burden them with the details. To them, it was enough that Mom and Dad were getting along again, at least for their sake. And we were getting along. I mean, I wouldn't call us friends, but we were civil. We'd talk when we needed to, mostly about the kids, and we kept things as peaceful as possible. It wasn't always easy, but it was better than the constant tension we used to have. During all of this, I started to focus on myself too. It had been so long since I'd done that, since before my dad got sick, honestly. I began working out again, spending time with friends, and even picking up hobbies I'd let go of over the years. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. And then a few months after the divorce, I met someone. Her name's Rachel, and she's a single mom too. We met through mutual friends and things just clicked. She's kind, funny, and understanding in a way I hadn't experienced in years. We started dating quietly, not wanting to rush anything, especially with the kids involved. But as things got more serious, I realized it was time to introduce her to them. I was nervous about how they'd react, but to my relief, they handled it well. Rachel's kids are close in age to mine, so they all got along right away. We had a barbecue at my house, and seeing them play together, laughing like they'd known each other forever, was a moment I'll never forget. For the first time, I felt like I could see a future, a good one. Of course, Emma noticed. She never said anything directly, but there was a shift in her attitude. She started bringing up memories of our life together, little things she hadn't mentioned in years. Then one day, while she was waiting for the kids to grab their stuff, she said it outright. She wanted to try again. She asked if we could go on a date just to see if there was anything left between us. I didn't know what to say at first. Part of me felt sorry for her. She seemed so vulnerable in that moment. But the other part of me knew the answer immediately. I told her about Rachel, about how happy I was and how much I valued the progress I'd made. I said I didn't think getting back together was a good idea, not just because of Rachel, but because of everything we'd been through. She took it better than I expected, though I could see the hurt in her eyes. She thanked me for being honest and said she understood. She even said she was happy for me, which I think she meant even if it stung. That conversation was hard, but it needed to happen. I think it gave both of us some closure. Now I'm in a place I never thought I'd be after everything that happened. My dad's health is improving, my kids are happy, and I've found someone who makes me feel alive again. Emma and I are co-parenting as best as we can, and while I don't know what the future holds, I do know this. I'm finally moving forward, and it feels good.